Hi there. In this video, we're going to tackle a new conversation in sort of environmental circles and environmental thinking, something that's really come to the forefront starting in early to mid 2025 and is continuing to this day. It is very much adjacent to environmental philosophy and ethics, and there isn't a much better place in the course to include it, but I think it's really important for you to not just know about sort of the historic thinking about environmentalism and environmental issues, but get a sense of what's going on within that broader conversation and movement today. And in recent months, since 2025, environmental protections have come under renewed scrutiny as uh, being significant impediments to doing things like solving the housing crisis or decarbonizing our economy. That environmental rules and regulations are becoming a an impediment to advancement as a society. And this is not something we're seeing from traditional critics of environmentalism, but rather from people essentially on our own side. And so I want to get into it and give you folks a sense of what's going on today. And so I'm going to go a brief overview of environmental regulations that have gone into effect in this country and then also in the state of California. But 1948 was the first main one with the Federal Pollution Control Act, the Environmental Policy Act, signed by that woke liberal Ronald Reagan. Um, was the first major environmental law, created the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. The Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the Endangered Species Act have all followed throughout the early 70s and provide the main framework for environmental protections nationally today. Uh, California itself has the California Environmental Quality Act, which requires developers and anyone who's building to do environmental surveying first. We also have a state environmental or Endangered Species Act, as well as our Coastal Initiative, Prop 20, and the Coastal Commission, which are designed to protect the coast specifically. And as you can imagine, if you know anything about California in relation to the rest of the United States, we have some of the most robust environmental policies and protection policies in the country. One of the key provisions to all of these laws that has made them uniquely effective in preserving the environment is the idea that citizens may step into the shoes of uh, government agencies and use the legal system to uh, protect or fight for environmental resources or animals, clean air, clean water, that sort of thing, on behalf of organisms that can't, for instance, and essentially gives citizens and groups the ability to challenge policymakers on specific decisions regarded to environmental issues and protections. This started with the Clean Air Act, and these citizen suits have become the primary tool by which uh, uh, different specific species or pieces of land or polluters are fought. And Between 1988 and 2022, there were 25,775 of these suits in federal court. So that's just federal court, not state court. So I'm sure there have been lots more here in California. And it's important, I think, to note that these have been very, very effective, these laws and the framework that they put into place in preventing extinction. At least 50 species that were threatened by extinction have been delisted. The bald eagle, the gray wolf, and the American alligator are all very classic and famous examples of species who, for one reason or another, were nearly disappearing or almost gone and brought back from the brink, due in no small part to protections afforded them by the Endangered Species Act and protections to their habitat that were afforded because of that. Also, in many American cities, water is objectively cleaner than it was prior to these acts. Pictured here is my hometown, Cleveland, Ohio. As you may or may not know, we had a entire river that caught on fire in 1969, and I'll say that again: the river, the water, the thing that we usually use to put out fires, caught on fire in 1969. Today, that lake or that river is beautiful. It's safe for recreating in, and a highlight of the revitalized downtown in the city. Um, and so again, Clean Water Act had a major role in solving this problem. And then for just one more to kind of bring it home, uh, here in Southern California, our air quality has improved by leaps and bounds since the Clean Air Act went into effect, as well as other measures that California has undertaken, like our gas tax and fuel additives and things like that. But uh, the point is, another really tremendous success when it comes to uh, uh, improving the quality of life for a lot of people, and making this part of the world much safer to live in, thanks to the Clean Air Act. Since its inception, there have been critiques of these policies from the pro business, pro capital side of politics. And I don't want to say Republican or Democrat because many of these early laws were signed by Republicans and many by President Ronald Reagan. So it was not the red versus blue issue that it is today, but it's always been more of sort of the pro business, pro capital, pro development versus the pro conservation sides of both political parties. And so the critiques have been that they cause economic hardship by making goods and property more expensive. They make it harder to build. If you have to go through environmental review, it's harder to build. Um, that these protections contribute to labor outsourcing to countries that don't have environmental protections, that they're just generally not a good use of tax dollars, and that they'll slow or stop innovation. So these have been critiques of the policies from the beginning. But what has changed, and what we'll get into in just a moment, are critiques of these policies from the political left, the pro-environmental folks in our system right now, and actually they're being critiqued as a impediment to solving big problems like climate change and mass transit and housing and things like that. And that's what I wanted to get into here. So coming out in the spring of 2025 was Abundance by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson. And I've never had a single book both challenge my preconceived notions as much as this one, or cause me to say, huh, well, maybe it is worth reconsidering my position here. And I want to speak to that very specifically and directly because I think it's something that, um, in general, we do not acknowledge or celebrate when someone changes their mind, except perhaps accuse them of being a flip flopper or being disingenuous or something like that. But the idea of encountering new information and changing one's thinking based on it is actually a really important skill. We shouldn't be dogmatic about anything, and so uh, I think it's worth highlighting and perhaps at times celebrating when you encounter new information that changes how you think and uh, uh, makes you see the world in a new way. So this book, Abundance, um, highlights a lot of different regulatory structures and not just environmental ones. It's a much broader look at things, but it does identify things like the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, and the Clean Air Act, and especially in the environmental review procedures that have come from it as being impediments to decarbonizing the economy and developing things like high-speed rail here in California, which will, or when, if it ever happens, will have a major impact on getting cars off the road and things like that. And so they're highly critical of the citizen review process and things like that. They show how like the California Environmental Quality Act has been one of the main reasons why we don't have high speed rail here, and with the idea that if we're going to create a new green energy grid, we have to build miles and miles and miles of transmission lines and solar panels and wind turbines and build all this stuff really, really fast. And they really do exemplify how environmental review becomes problematic to that. Another book that came out in 2025 that to not nearly as much fanfare is Why Nothing Works by Mark J. Dunkelman. And it covers a very, very similar topic. It takes a more sort of broad historical uh, look at it rather than just focusing on the present, and looks at the compares the past when we as a nation undertook some major rapid development projects like the Tennessee Valley Authority, where major parts of Appalachia were brought onto the electric grid very, very rapidly as part of a solution to the Great Depression. Um, or the interstate system, which was built very, very rapidly, and looks at why, as a government, the government we have can't doesn't seem to be able to function in the same way. They look at how like the uh, the major infrastructure bill that was passed under the previous president Joe Biden that promised rural broadband in 4 years. Very, very little, if any, of the broadband that had been promised and paid for in that bill has actually yet been to be delivered. And it is in part because of, again, these regulatory impediments that environmental review, amongst other things, create. And Why Nothing Works really focuses on how our distrust of centralized authority has created government institutions that are so bound by supervising themselves and regulating themselves, and allowing individual stakeholders to block entire projects out of fear that people won't be that the broader community's needs won't be met, has paralyzed decision making. And once again, environmental review is a specific example. They cite development of some kind going on in New England, um, that was stopped based on the potential presence of a particular turtle species, and describe how the people involved in the review process, in this case the wildlife biologists, had major incentives to work to block the development. That was their entire role, um, despite that there might have been a significant public benefit for it. So once again, really challenging the idea of the citizen suit provisions and highlighting how they have um, been fairly successful at blocking development of any kind, even when there's broad agreement that that development is necessary, like with housing. So another local example, the Orange Heights development, which we looked at an earlier video, but is worth another note because of how it relates to this conversation. Um, this development has been halted indefinitely because of the presence of a endangered bumblebee, um, and this lawsuit uses the framework of the California Environmental or Endangered Species Act, and claims that the developers didn't do their SQL review thoroughly enough because they didn't discover the presence of this bumblebee. And the thing is, when it comes to insects, they're just understudied, and they're the most diverse group of organisms on the planet. For instance, about 15, 16 years ago, I was working for the Cleveland Museum of Natural History in Cleveland, Ohio, and we were doing some insect studies in the area, and I collected a beetle that ended up being the first record of that particular beetle species in the state of Ohio. And that sounds like a really interesting scientific discovery, but it has more to do with the fact that nobody had bothered to collect ground beetles in that particular area before, not because it was some, you know, historic discovery. And so if we can use the presence of particular insect species to stop development, then, well, it's easy to see how nothing gets built. Again, the Orange Heights example is not perfect because there are ecological reasons why one might not want to develop in that particular spot, it being a wildlife corridor and there being significant wildfire risk. So it's an imperfect example. I don't think that this critique of proceduralism necessarily changes my mind fully on that development specifically, but I think it is something that is really worth giving a hard thought about, and understanding why. Um, I mean, it's a big part of why we got into the place where we are with housing here in California. There's just not enough of it. Fortunately, um, I, there seems to be some consensus amongst our policymakers that this is a problem worth addressing. And in 2025, Gavin Newsom and the California legislature passed some updates and changes to the California Environmental Quality Act that appear to be taken straight from the pages of Abundance. They've made an exemption for infill housing, so that means for areas that are already developed or already zoned for housing, you do no longer need to go through CEQA review, which is a really big deal. There are also exceptions for advanced manufacturing and industrial use. Um, Exemptions for childcare centers and mixed use zoning. So again, this is in an area where businesses are allowed. If you're going to build a new childcare center, you don't need to do the environmental quality review. Streamline the review, and it also has streamlined the review process for all housing projects to try and uh, make it possible to build faster. You know, I think we'll all see Gavin Newsom doing quite a bit of this type of stuff for the next few years. It seems pretty obvious he's planning on running for president, and so trying to demonstrate that California is not the quagmire that it appeared to be, say, in Abundance, I think is very much within his desire and purview right now, and we'll see how it goes. Just from my own personal experience, I feel, this is just vibes. It's not based on any data, but I live in Irvine, and I feel like in the last 6 to 8 months, housing, multi-unit housing, apartment complexes and condos are going up all over the place. And maybe again, that's just vibes, and I'm seeing it because I've been thinking about it, but I feel like there's more housing being built here now than in any other time that I've lived here. And so, what's next? Ultimately, this is going to be of a huge debate amongst environmentalists, environmental thinkers, environmental policymakers, and our assumptions about the need to protect animals and water and air are going to be challenged. And I'm not here to say that we shouldn't have protections for those things. And I'm definitely not saying that we should abandon all of the environmental laws that have gotten us to where we are today. But I think there's very clear evidence presented that they've created a system that needs reform. And I'll be very interested to see what comes of that in the coming years, especially as we go through another presidential election cycle and see lots of people trying to define themselves as different from the Democrats of the past that have lost so much and so often. So we'll see how it goes. And again, just really interesting food for thought, and has changed my perspective on some of these things.